We all want to feel peace in our lives, peace in our choices, our beliefs, our relationships, and our environment. I've learned that this desired contentment is often found through holding on to less. When we pare down what we own, what we consume, and what we value, we're left with what's intentional, a personalized curation of what is important and true and useful to us. I'm Shannon Leyko, and you're listening to Paring Down, a podcast aimed at helping you declutter not only your home, but any area of your life that's overwhelming. Here, we're having interesting and honest conversations about the physical and mental clutter that drowns out what truly matters to each of us. And together, we'll learn how to pare it all down, not for the sake of perfection or becoming rigid, rather so we can move through life with less overwhelm and more joy, wisdom, and peace. Welcome back to Paring Down, everyone. My name is Shannon Leyko, and today's conversation is one that is really meaningful to me just because I feel like in my own journey of decluttering my home, I've come to find a tremendous passion for understanding the consumption side of things too, and like why we let so much excess into our homes and how that relates to our values, to our spirituality, to just like our sense of what's important. We're often talking on this podcast about paring down the things that actually matter and making room for those things through decluttering. But today's conversation is particularly interesting because I have on Jeff Golden, who has been researching for a decade about this misconception that money and happiness align. I think most of us recognize that, oh, money can't buy happiness. And you'll hear him talk a little bit about that. But that's not really reflected in our spending or our contentment. We often want more and more and more. We think if I only had enough money for this, we start to feel bitter about how much money we have. We get angry. All of that stuff is rooted in this idea that we think money can buy happiness, that we would be happier if we had more. We're mad at the people who have more. We want more. We're discontent. We want to buy more and more things. Why? Just because we think it's cute or we think it's going to make our life better. And so we really have this conflated idea of happiness and money, even if we can logically say money doesn't buy happiness, right? Like that is just hot air unless that shows up in our lives. I hope you find this conversation as enlightening as I did. But first, let me tell you a little bit about Jeff Golden. Jeff is the author of Reclaiming the Sacred, which is the winner of the Nautilus Grand Prize and named Best Environmental Book of 2023 by Indie Reader. He has written and taught about these topics for over 30 years, most recently as a scholar in residence at Vassar College. He is a former Fulbright Scholar in Sustainable Development. He was awarded the U.S. State Department's Millennium International Volunteer Award, and he has headed several nonprofits dedicated to the environment and social justice. He has worked with Nobel Peace Prize laureates. He was the lead of the creation of one of the greenest certified buildings in the United States, and he has penned a monthly column on sustainability. He organized a series of prison justice protests featured on Democracy Now!, and he has served as a liaison between the Mohican Nation and their homeland in New York. Jeff has been featured on NPR, USA Today, Environment Times, iHeartRadio, Talk Radio Europe, and tons of other media locations, and that is for good reason. You will find him to be incredibly engaging, heartwarming, positive, and overall just really sharing a message that I think will have a profound impact on all of our lives. So without further ado, let's welcome Jeff Golden to the show. Jeff, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I think this is going to be an episode that leaves people really considering what brings them true happiness.
I love that. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, well, would you tell everyone a little bit about who you are and what you're all about?
Absolutely. Well, maybe the most important way of talking about my past and who I am just has to do with the fact that I've always been someone who cares deeply about the world, about other people, about other creatures. And I've found myself moving in different directions in my life, trying to find ways to make a difference. And that's been in the nonprofit world, activist-y world. It's a lot of that journey has also been about my own personal growth and healing and things like that. And about 15 years ago now, because it was over 10 years that I spent researching and writing my book, Reclaiming the Sacred, that some serendipitous intertwining of the things in my life brought me to this point where I hadn't thought about writing a book before. I had written a regular column on sustainability and sustainable living, how we can each live in a way that's in a bit more in harmony with nature, things like that. But the book came to me and took off, and it took off and took off and took off. Like I said, it was over 10 years, and it changed a lot over that time. But meanwhile, I was also teaching courses at Vassar where I was getting to apply a lot of this and do a lot of hands-on activities with people and sort of opening this stuff up. And it culminated in really the launch pad for why it is that I get to be here talking with you today has been the book. The book has won some wonderful awards and has really been really meaningful to a lot of people. And so it's now my pleasure to get to go out and talk about it. So it's a
I'm so
snippet.
excited, and for those, I will have said it, I'm sure, in the intro. For the people listening, they know that it's
Yeah.
casual around here, and so I have not recorded his intro yet. But his book is "Reclaiming the Sacred: Healing Our Relationships with Ourselves and the World,"
Yeah.
which I'm so excited to dive into how that can relate to consumption and happiness and money and all of those kind of convoluted concepts. What course did you teach at Vassar, by the way?
Well, I did get to teach a course that I titled Reclaiming the Sacred, which really was about everything that we're going to talk about today. I also got to teach a course on building inclusive communities, which was really about interpersonal relationships, communication, conflict resolution, as well as looking at a lot of the impact of different social identities, is the term that is sometimes used. By that, we're talking about like race, gender, class, nationality, the way that all of those things just intersect in our lives so that we can create communities that really are more inclusive and thriving for everyone.
Hmm.
So that was a wonderful class, and that's what brought me to Vassar originally. And while I was there, I got to develop this course around the content of reclaiming the sacred.
Amazing. Was that sociology then? Was that the department?
That's a great question because that kind of class is increasingly being sought at different colleges and universities, and they aren't always quite sure where to put it. And as was the case with Vassar, sometimes it depends mostly on the people who end up making it happen. And in this case, it was the head of the education department. So,
Oh,
yep.
interesting. I had to ask just because I my degree is in psychology, and so there
Uh-huh.
that sounds like something that would be right there in sociology. Could go psych, could go
Absolutely.
communications. I mean, there's so many places. So that is really
Absolutely.
cool. Well, can you tell us what you mean just in the title when you say
Yeah.
reclaiming the sacred?
Yeah.
What would you define as the sacred?
I love that. It's one of the first things I address in the book and also in my course because I not only taught that course at Vassar, but I do teach an online course that actually is available to anyone by donation. So anyone out there listening who finds these topics intriguing and wants to dive deeper, that's available. And for me, I want to be clear that sacred oftentimes is thought of in the context of a particular religion. You know, within a particular religion, there are objects or names or ideas that are considered sacred. For me, it's more expansive than that, although in some ways it gets at the same thing, which is what are those things that are truly of the greatest importance? And there really is this intersection between consumption and money and happiness that all has to do with our relationships with ourselves. And we live in a society right now where, strangely, in a country that is so rooted in ideas like freedom and individuality and everything, so many of us often get lost in the society, get caught up, and especially, as you know, around money and consumption and stuff. And so looking at how can we live lives that really are more at harmony with other people and the environment, and also that nourish us more deeply, those were the questions that brought me to this book. And ultimately, that question of reclaiming the sacredness of us and the world around us. So reclaiming the sacred ended up being just sort of the central idea and felt like the best way to communicate what this book and my work are about, even though it does mean I sometimes have to take a moment to clarify what I mean by sacred. Ultimately, I love taking that word and very clearly and resoundingly saying, you are sacred, I'm sacred, our lives, this world, this miracle of life and experience is sacred.
Hmm.
Yep.
It's kind of a higher level umbrella, I would say, of just the concept of things that matter, right? Like that
Yeah.
That's what's sacred is relationships matter and our well-being matters, and the things that are sacred to us, it can be very personal too. Obviously there are things that are
Yes.
sacred within this world that's more applies to everybody, but obviously this is going to be very individualized at the same time. So
Yes.
on this topic of money as it relates to material things, you've
Yeah.
spent 10 years really researching and looking at that intersection there.
Right.
Why do you think, first of all, we are so hooked on the idea that more money and material things will make us happy, even when the research says otherwise?
Right. Right. Well, I want to start by perhaps offering some context for people, which really speaks to that. I think the central answer to what you're asking is it's about the messaging and the culture around us. What are we constantly told by the media, movies, songs, and what sort of wisdom ends up being parsed out of that and passed down to us through our family and friends and the people around us as well? And I think that the truth around the trajectory of where we're going as a society, how money has fit into our lives, is not a story that is often told in mainstream media. I mean, I think that all of us have some sense of the idea that money doesn't buy happiness, and it sounds great in songs, and it's obviously a pretty profound teaching in some of the world's religions, right? Things like that. And yet, when it comes down to it, most of us throughout our daily lives are getting exactly the opposite message. So, when I said I like to offer some context, is because in some ways, I think the truth about the disconnect between money and happiness actually is not something that people hear a lot about, or at least in some of the specifics around what the research has revealed in the last 30 years. So, when I talk about larger context, I like to go back to the 1940s because, interestingly, since at least the 1940s, the average level of happiness in the United States has been in a consistent decline. It's not a dramatic decline, but it is consistent. And that might just be an interesting sort of bit of trivia, except that when you consider how our lives and this society have changed since the 1940s, in the 1940s, a phone was still a luxury. In the
Mm-hmm.
1940s, a third of people didn't have indoor plumbing, right? These sorts of things, as well as there was still a lot of scarcity coming out of World War II. I mean, sugar and medicines were in short supply. The size of people's homes, the amount of money that they made, all of these things, it was like an entirely different universe. And yet, they were happier than we are. Again, that's not generally the message that's shared on the nightly news or in movies or songs or something like that, which tend to measure progress and success by the accumulation of money, by how much money are we making, how productive is the economy, things like that. And yet, what economists and psychologists have been able to sort of sort out from all of the research is that money accounts for about 3 to 4% of our happiness.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. And most of that 3 to 4% comes from some heavy lifting that money does when you are lacking in everything. So, in other words, once you can meet your basic needs at a very simple level, money doesn't do much for you anymore. But before that, it definitely does. When money is buying you food, your daily food, or shelter, clothing, basic healthcare, these kinds of things, that's where money does make a big difference. And
Right.
anyone who's listening who's experienced sort of, either dips or long periods of time living in poverty, they can speak clearly to how that does affect our well-being, right? And yet it's also usually those people who can speak most clearly to the other things that still, even in that state, mattered more. And I'll give one more example, and then we can get back to our conversation because I feel like I'm going on and on with your
No, it's
question. I,
great.
I
I'm
love it.
fascinated. I love all of it.
Good,
Keep
good.
going.
There was a study done looking at homeless people in Calcutta, India, and homeless people in Oregon and California. And despite the fact that the people in India lived in stark deprivation by comparison, I mean, their access to food and healthcare and shelter was so much more limited than what the homeless people in the United States experienced. And yet, when they were sort of surveyed, they said that overall they were happy. They were satisfied with their lives, which the people in the US did not say. So there was this marked difference between how happy or satisfied they were with their lives. And the key factor they determined, and it was really the people in the United States that gave them the clue to this, when they were asked, what do you miss most living this homeless life now? And they very consistently said connections with friends and family. So they didn't say even food or shelter. It was about that human connection. And what they figured out was that the people in India, just given the society and culture, they were homeless, and yet they had managed to maintain more of these kinds of relationships. There's the hierarchy of needs, of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You, as a psychologist background, have probably heard about this. In our popular culture, it's understood as this thing where we have basic needs that have to be met before we can meet our higher needs. And the truth is, and actually Maslow even acknowledged this at the time, it doesn't quite work that way. Some of those higher level needs, a sense of purpose, connection with other people, actually flip it around and matter more, generally speaking, than food, shelter. And I'm not trying to minimize the importance of adequate food or shelter, right? And yet again, those of us who've lived and experienced that kind of deprivation can speak to the fact that, you know, what was your relationship like with your parents while you were homeless or while you were sort of not getting as much food as you wanted? Things like that. How safe did you feel with the people around you? These kinds of things actually still matter more, even when we don't have enough, which just drives the point home even further that once you do have enough to meet your basic needs, these other things are so much more important. And what often ends up happening, unfortunately, is that in the pursuit of ever more money and stuff, we compromise those things that actually do matter. So we actually end up worse off, which kind of is part of that explanation of how is it possible that people today, on average, are less happy than we were in the 1940s? And that's part of it is that we generally have become extremely materialistic, focus a lot of money, time, a lot of our attention on money and stuff and work. And not only is it that, well, it doesn't do much more for us, but we end up compromising these things. So we end up living less happily and less purposefully than we could otherwise.
Less purposefully. Yeah, you
If
couldn't have
that's a
said that
word.
better. No, yeah, I hope it is because that's what I clung on to. That's the part that I was like, yes.
Good.
And all of that, and it was interesting as you were talking, it reminded me of my time I spent in India when I was 16 and then again when I was 18. And I worked
Mm,
in AIDS homes. I did some tsunami relief areas for orphans who lost both their parents in the 2004 tsunami over there in Chennai.
mm,
And where else? In leper colonies as well. We went out there for a couple of days. So just a lot of these communities, whether it's orphans or the AIDS community
yeah,
or leper community that are very much cast out from
yeah,
society.
right.
And I found at that young age where I didn't know anything. I still don't know anything. Let's be honest. Here we are 20 years later. I don't know anything,
Still figuring it
but
out.
still figuring it out. But it was such a tremendous lesson in life
Mm,
because I remember coming home and my mom asked me, "What did you learn?" And I said that they're happier over there than we are.
mm,
Everyone was happier than we were, whether it was the children in the AIDS home or the people in the leper colony or just members of maybe the church we worked in. And some of
mhm,
those people let us into their homes and they lived in these cinder block, one room houses with their two kids and they took turns who got to have a pillow that night sleeping on the floor. I mean,
yeah,
and they were happy and they were
right.
generous. They offered me every time I went into someone's home and they had nothing. They said, "Here's a hair tie." And I told that story actually on an episode I did about generosity, about the hair tie. But really, this happiness was so obvious to me that
Yeah,
that was the biggest takeaway when I was 16. I
yeah,
went back when I was 18 and I was just so excited to go back to experience the joy that these people had. And throughout life, I've often wondered where that joy came from. Uh,
yeah,
and I'm curious your thoughts on this, but the more I've contemplated that over the
yeah.
last 2 decades, the more to me I see that perhaps there's less of a sense of entitlement
Mm,
and expectation. And because of that, they aren't they aren't so caught up in themselves and what they deserve, and that so that bitterness doesn't grow, that
Hmm.
hamster wheel doesn't grow of trying to chase more and more and more. Obviously
Yeah.
they have different availabilities to them in terms of what they could chase, but what is your take on entitlement and expectation?
Yeah, wow, my brain just went with all the different directions of all the different things you said. I mean, first of all, what an extraordinary experience you had. Again, when you were 16 and 18, what a wonderful thing to have in your back pocket. I had an experience, not in India, but, and I won't go into the details, but it was one of those times in my life when I was in my early 20s, and I recognized that I need so little to be happy. Basically, it was at this point where I was like, if the rest of my life, this was all that I had, I could be happy. And it was such a wonderful thing for me to have in my back pocket, knowing that, oh my gosh, the worst case scenario, if this is what my life was, it could still be wonderful. And it sounds like that's part of what you experienced. Mother Teresa, you've probably heard of her. She's been canonized as a saint in the Catholic tradition, and lived and worked among some of the most extremely poor people in Calcutta, India. She visited the United States at least once. I don't know how many times, but the comment that has lived on is that she said that she has never experienced a poverty of spirit as profound as what she experienced in the United States.
Whew.
And that's coming from someone who was coming from such a place of material poverty, but she was speaking about something that, in some ways, getting back to that title, Reclaiming the Sacred, about what really matters most. Like when you have lived your life, or when you're alone with the stars in the sky at night, just you and this universe, what really matters? How do you want to have lived your life? And I think what she was speaking to is the fact that for some cultural reasons and for some psychological reasons that we can dive into, there are ways that we in the United States have gotten very off track from some of those things that matter on that most intimate, private, just spiritual level. And I use that word spiritual broadly. For some of us, that really does mean a religious context. For some people, it really is about a broader sense, or a different sense, anyway, of a connection with nature, spirit, the universe. Um, Whatever that means to you, there are some profound things that a lot of us get distanced from in the pace of life here and the focus on consumption. And in the book, in part three, I break down, there are really, it seems like psychologists and economists have figured out that there are really five ways that money hooks us. Given that it's not doing much for our happiness, why is it so important to so many of us? And there are really these five categories, and we can go into those, but the summary I would give is that for every single one of those, what it comes down to a large degree, is that we are trying to make up for the absence of the things that really do matter. So
Mm.
there might be some ways that we have these hardwired things. I mean, on the most basic level, when we buy something, we get more money, we get a boost of endorphins. Like there's a little shot of something that feels good. It goes away very quickly. And so again, it's not necessarily the answer to long-term sustainable fulfillment, but but that little boost can be very important to us if we are feeling lonely or scared or unhappy in our lives, if we're feeling depressed. And so it's an example of the fact that it's in the absence of some of the things that give our lives deeper meaning, a sense of place and purpose, joy, security, that these other things, even this little biological impulse, can hook into. Another one is, um, these really clever studies were done where they asked people, would you rather, for example, would you rather receive $100,000 a year as sort of your salary, or $50,000, but where if you earn $100,000, everyone else around you gets 200,000. If you get $50,000, but everyone else gets 25,000, which would you rather have? And there are many of us who are like, well, I'd rather make less but have more than everyone else because of how that feels, how that looks. But perhaps not surprisingly, in each of these cases, in each of the five different categories, again, the more that we feel rooted in ourselves, that we are experiencing purpose and joy and place, that we have friends and family, the things that really do matter, these things just don't hook us, or not nearly as much, right? Or they might be just things we dip into a little bit now and then, for fun. But the way that people can become so addicted to consumption, or even if you wouldn't call it an addiction, it's just something that we're super caught up in and orient our lives around, those things just lose their hook when we're rooted more firmly in the things that do matter. So that is part of the answer. The fifth generous category of those five ways that money hooks us does have to do with culture. And there is something profound about this culture and the level of materialism. I mean, by certain objective measures, we are the most materialistic culture that has existed, or one of them. And I think it is fundamental. And if you take a moment and step back, I mean, step out of the sort of the little world that we're moving in and all of its values and messages, there are many ways in which I think it's sort of obvious that the society is off in some ways, and in ways that we should really owe it to ourselves to think about because of the quality of our own lives and as well as the quality of the lives of the people and creatures around us. But I mean, when you look at some of the things that we as a society have done in the pursuit of ever more money and stuff, I mean, the things we have done to the environment, the things that are currently happening in the world, we're at a critical moment in human history and world history in terms of how quickly species are disappearing, how quickly ecosystems are disappearing. We talk about more than half of the species on the planet might be gone by the end of the century. And we continue to make these decisions and pursue ever more money and stuff, even though, again, we have far more than we need to actually maximize as happy as we could be. And we could be much happier if we shifted our orientation as well. So,
Right. Well, and that right there, I think, speaks to that entitlement piece that was kind of on my mind
hmm
because, and I've shared this before on the podcast too, the reason that I care so much about sustainability and how that relates to consumption, right? How our consumption is affecting the planet is because I care about my kids and their
yeah,
kids. And it's not just this like woo woo future generations matter. Like, no, no, no. I hug my children every single morning and they are going to be here, God willing, for decades after I am. And then I'm going to
right,
love my grandchildren someday so dearly. And they're going to be
right,
here more decades, after.
right,
And like, and then what am I say? Oh, I don't care about them and how they feel towards their children. Like, no, this is very personal to me
yeah,
that I don't feel so entitled to have whatever I want that it does not matter how it affects the longevity of the planet we live on. To
yeah,
me, that is common sense empathy. That is a reflection of love. It is not anything really all that dramatic, if you ask me. It's not fear mongering, it's
yeah,
just reality.
yeah,
And it's kind of hard these days to talk about it without there being some controversy attached.
yeah,
But, to me, that sense of entitlement says it doesn't matter how it's affecting this planet. It doesn't matter how it affects
yeah,
future generations or animals or any living thing, other than the fact that I want to buy a bunch of cool little trends because it makes me feel better about myself. That is entitled. I am entitled to get
yeah,
whatever I want at the expense
yeah,
of whoever. I'm kind of going off, but you can tell how passionate I feel about this. And the problem, too, then, it's not just obviously there's so much that goes into this. It's not just like people have no morals. It's also then, like you said, there are so many factors that play psychologically into the
yes,
temptation to buy and the way that we are fed information in order to buy, the attention economy. And it's not just a lack of self-control or a lack of empathy. We're
yeah,
humans and it's hard to quote do the right thing in the face of so much pressuring us to
yeah,
not do the quote right thing,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and part of that, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, is that you were talking about basic needs.
yeah,
That our basic needs, yes, do need to be met. That's the 2 to 4% of money that does help our happiness, and we respect the fact that having food makes us happier. Having
yeah,
shelter makes us
yeah,
happier.
yeah.
But I'm curious, do you think that in Western society we've redefined what we see as material basic needs for survival?
Oh, absolutely. And once again, I'm going to say, oh my gosh, so interesting. Everything you just said. I have like 30 things I want to say if I can even remember half of them. The answer to that is yes. I want to say that, when it comes to some of these topics that you said are kind of controversial, what was really interesting to me in looking at this research is that, for example, global warming, something like 95% of the average Americans and something like 99% of scientists all agree that global warming is happening and it's human caused. But there are a whole lot of other people, that is to say politicians and the media, that tend to keep putting out different messages. And it does create a sense that there's this tension where actually our society is pretty united around a lot of this, but it gets sort of fractured at that political level, no
Hmm.
surprise. But so I find that heartening because it means that we can talk about these things that really do matter and we can root them in conversations about our love for our children and even our love for ourselves, for our neighbors, for our communities, for other creatures. It can be rooted in love. It's not some vitriolic kind of thing. It's about our hearts. And again, to use the word I was using, sacred. It's about reclaiming the sacredness of us in the world. And now, how do we act? Now, what do we need and want?
Hey guys, it's time for your ad break. Each week, I like to say a huge thank you for your graciousness that these are part of the podcast. Here we go.
There were some studies done, and one in particular where what they found was that not only is there this thing where the more money that we have, the more that we are compromising the things that do matter, but the very pursuit of money and prioritizing of money itself actually undermines our happiness. And the foremost researcher in this area, Ed Diner, and the psychology of happiness, the quote from him about how he summarized all this research was that materialism is toxic for happiness. Now, for me, I really like to continually come back to that because I think that there are many ways in which we might have a sense that there are all these things that we should be doing, right? If we care about the planet, if we care about our children and other people, other creatures, but it's sort of this contradiction with the things that are good for me and that are going to make my life better or help create a better society. And what the research shows is that generally speaking that contradiction does not exist. And what I like to emphasize is that when I talk about the ways that we can live that are going to make us more joyful, give us more purposeful, I'm going to keep using that word, right? Um, it's a win-win. Again, it's not this contradiction of like, well, how much can you do to save the planet where it's a sacrifice? It's how much can you do to make yourself freer and more joyful? And guess what? You're contributing to the things that need to be happening at this other level as well. Yes, the entitlement is extraordinary to me, and I think that one of the two things that come to mind. One is that I think it rarely is in popular culture framed in this sense of you're actually doing something that is causing great harm to other people. So it's not just about your individual freedom to just have as much as you want, or as big as you want, or consume as much as you want, or something. It actually has very serious consequences. And I think we as a society have always cared deeply about the well-being of our neighbors and other people, the world around us. It's something that I think we as Americans pride ourselves on. And there are some statistics about, for example, the amount of money that we donate in the United States far surpasses what many people do throughout the world. So there's a way in which we care about being generous. We care about the future of our children. And the fact that there's a huge contradiction between that and how we're living, though, often gets lost.
Hmm. I appreciate that positive spin on it because it's true. I think I have an interesting take on the world, or at least opportunity to experience the world slightly different as a military family. We
Yeah,
move so often
right.
and we live in different parts of the country. We live in different types of societies. And what I have found with each move is no matter what area of the country you're in, whether they have different political stances than you might agree with, whether they have a different people are interested in things that you wouldn't be interested in, and all of that,
Yeah,
you find that they, as a whole, people are fabulous. They really are. Of
I
course,
think
there are
so.
outliers, okay?
Yeah,
Like there's crazies anywhere you go. But I've definitely found that. And even when I worked, as a waitress, I think is a great example of a way to be exposed to lots of different kinds of people. And I worked in Times Square for many years
Mm,
as a waitress. And I always walked away saying, for every one table of people who were jerks,
right.
there were 20 other tables of people I
Yeah.
wanted to be best friends with. And
Right.
when they left the restaurant. And so I just appreciate that positive take because it does remind us that we are not incapable of changing some of our decisions, not just as a sacrifice, like you said, not even just as a point of empathy, because we
Right.
are empathetic, loving
Right.
people. If you're listening to this podcast, I have no doubt you're an empathetic, loving person.
Right.
But also, I do respect that point so much that you said that it affects us and our well being too. It is a
Yeah.
win win because nobody
Yeah.
wants to look back on their deathbed and say, what was the point of my life? And in
Yeah.
order to live with purpose, I love Joshua Becker's definition of purpose, where he says it's the intersection of your passions, your skill set, and meeting the needs of another. And that
Mm,
is where you get purpose. And it
hmm.
involves not only meeting the needs of other people, like you said, but then you get to live into it and feel like, oh, I can look back on my life and feel like I mattered too. And
Yeah.
that sense of like self actualization
Yeah.
is paramount for our own happiness.
Absolutely. And what we haven't done yet that I'd love to take a moment and do is just walk through, well, what are those things that really matter? Because I've referred
Yes.
to some of them, and I think of them in two categories. There are the things that have to do with the world around us and our inner worlds. When it comes to the world around us, it is things like friends and family. How much time do we spend with friends and family? How many people do you feel really know you or that you could call on in a time of need? Those are some of the metrics that psychologists have found really matter in terms of how happy people are. Are you getting enough sleep? Do you get some physical activity? And both of those, that one actually isn't as important as the friends and family, strikingly. Both of those are far more important than how much money you have. Um, and interestingly, those are two great examples of ones that we often in this society compromise in the pursuit of money and work and things like that, right? But at the end of the day, what matters even more than those things are those internal factors. And we kind of referenced that a little bit earlier in terms of just who are you in this world, regardless of how much you have, who are you and how do you see yourself in the world? And one of those has to do with a sense of wonder and gratitude. Not a surprise, right? And actually, this was something I meant to mention earlier, but they found that the more money that someone has, just on average, not as a strict rule, but the more fleeting that joy is, and the less someone is able to savor life's simple pleasures. And it speaks to a little bit what you were asking about, like how is it that we get so caught up on that in this society? And you can see again the way that as we start to pursue that more and more, well, if it disconnects us more, actually from our joy and sense of purpose, then we might find ourselves leaning into it ever more heavily to try and make up for it, right? To buy more or shop
Mm.
more or work more, things like that. But um,
It's a snowball effect.
yeah, it is. So having a sense of just presence and gratitude and wonder, our connection with our emotions is very important. And interestingly, yes, people who are experiencing what we think of as positive emotions tend to be happier. But overall, the happiest people are people who allow themselves to experience a range of emotions where you aren't keeping that part of you, that vital, essential part of your humanness, sort of locked up or under a vice. And maybe there are times where you don't want to break down sobbing, like if you're a pilot and you're landing the plane, right? But otherwise, most of us go through our lives acting as if we're always landing that plane, and there's never a good moment to feel this pain or sadness or just even the frustration or the hecticness of a day. I mean, I love thinking about kids in this. Like, little kids do not censor their feelings. They aren't sitting there thinking, well, is this worthy of me crying about? No. They cry, they feel it, and pretty quickly they also move on. And there's a vibrancy to that, getting
Mm.
to experience the fullness of who we are. So that's important. And a sense of purpose. You and I have both mentioned this, but having a sense of purpose in life is also another one of those big things that really matters. Um, if you would allow me, I've opened my book to this one page because it just felt so relevant to what we were talking about. I'd love to just read one page from it that has to do with presence and gratitude and wonder.
Yes, please. And first
Sound
thing I'm doing
good?
when this interview ends is going to go order your book. So please, I want a little sneak peek.
Wonderful. Well, when we finish, I'm going to get your address so I can send you one and sign it for you. But that sounds great.
Oh,
So, the very beginning of chapter 11, it's called Living in Mystery, Magic, and Miracle. And it reads thusly. The book Charlotte's Web tells the story of a pig, Wilbur, who lives on a farm, and a spider, Charlotte, who weaves messages into her web about how wonderful Wilbur is, so that he will not be slaughtered by the owners of the farm. The following conversation takes place among two of the townspeople after the first message appears. "Have you heard about the word that appeared in the spider's web?" asked Mrs. Arable nervously. "Yes," replied the doctor. "Well, do you understand it?" asked Mrs. Arable. "Understand what?" "Do you understand how there could be any writing in a spider's web?" "Oh, no," said Dr. Dorian, "I don't understand it. But for that matter, I don't understand how a spider learned to spin a web in the first place. When the words appeared, everyone said they were a miracle, but nobody pointed out that the web itself is a miracle. Or we might add that the spider itself is a miracle, and the light the web shone by, and the breath and the beating hearts of these two people having this conversation, and the sky, the earth, me, you, everything. I may, like Dr. Dorian, be using the word miracle in a slightly different way than people commonly use it, but I think it's really a better use of the word. It invites us to see the world in a way that is not only more beautiful and alive, but that is also fundamentally more honest and true. It's like in a story where someone looks at a bookshelf when the light is exactly right and a door reveals itself, opening onto an entire other magical world. That is the universe we live in, one grounded entirely in magic, held together in magic, and recreated every moment in magic. All we have to do is get a slightly different angle on just what a miracle is, and let the just right light of that concept, miracle, reveal to us the magic all around us. It is an invitation to awe, to presence, to gratitude, and to greater happiness.
thank you.
And as that passage suggests, one of the most significant findings in this research that I'd love to end with, I know we're going to have to wrap up soon, is that so much of what we care about and want for ourselves and our children and our world is actually, generally speaking, inherent to us. It is part of who we are. What often happens is that we get disconnected from it. There are these ways that barriers get erected within us and around us, separating us from this. But what that passage speaks to is the fact that the world is inherently a miracle and full of wonder. And it doesn't take going out there and doing all kinds of things or recreating ourselves to find the joy and wonder in the world. Actually, what it takes more of is just slowing down and dropping into ourselves and being present to the truth of the wondrousness of ourselves in the world. And I'm realizing I actually skipped over what is the single most important factor in terms of our inner worlds, and that has to do with our relationship with ourselves. How do we feel about ourselves? And there are a lot of ways that this society grinds in a lot of negative messages, ways that we learn and repeat that negative stuff in our heads. But again, ultimately, it's about letting that stuff go. It's not about going out and needing to create something or find something different. This is who we are and what the world is. So I love that passage for inviting us to, again, it's about just open that door, shine that just right light on yourself and this world. And as we start to make those shifts, as we create space for that, things start to shift of their own in the world around us and in our lives.
Exactly right. They are all so interwoven. All of the things and all of the elements you have mentioned that do contribute to happiness. They're just all so interwoven. I mean, I couldn't love this concept of awe and wonder anymore. My kids were home from school and it was raining super hard and everyone was kind of sick. So I was letting them get some TV time in, which they love because we don't have endless TV time around here.
Hmm.
And I love the rain. When we lived in Ketchikan, Alaska, a part of what I know for a fact contributed to how happy I was when we lived there was the constant awe and wonder. And it was in the
Mm,
rainforest of Alaska. A lot of people only think of the tundra, but we were in the Tongass rainforest. And so it rained constantly. And with that rain came so much beauty. And we had the
mm,
mountains and the bald eagles and, the orcas and humpbacks in our backyard, essentially. And it
amazing.
was really something spectacular. But the rain, I fell in love with. Most people get, seasonal depression if there's rain. I get so excited. So I paused the TV for the kids and I said, you guys, I want you to close your eyes. They're 3, 5, and 7, so they're young.
Hmm.
But I said, I want you to close your eyes for 30 seconds. We're just going to listen to the rain because you know how much mommy loves the rain. So we turned off the TV and did a single one of them open their eyes at 30 seconds? No, they were in it and they were listening. And I let them kind of slowly open their eyes and I said, thanks for doing that with me. And my daughter said, no, can you turn the TV off? I want to listen to more rain. And my son said, no, I want to watch the show. Or I was like, okay, fine. So
Fair
I took
enough.
her outside and she and I stood in our covered porch and just watched the rain and listened. And, whenever we're driving, our kids don't get screens in the car. So we're looking outside a lot. And we love looking at the sunsets. And oftentimes, if we get home around sunset, we will stand in the driveway and just look up at the sky. And I love to point out what I think is amazing, and so that they get used to pointing out what they think is amazing, because I think
Yeah.
awe and wonder is a practice. We have to practice, like you said, seeing the magic around us, and it connects us to the world and to each other in such monumental ways that goes beyond a single sunset. And I love that you brought that up, because I've found that to be such a key piece of my own happiness.
And I find it so incredible that we are given so many gifts. Our very lives, our breath, the world around us is filled with these gifts, these miracles of creation. And so often we do become distanced from them and don't appreciate them. And there's such a loss in that for us and for the world, in that disconnect. And so I love it that you got to spend that time with your kids.
Oh, it's just the best. It really is. And I want one more thing I wanted to ask if you've read it, but I wanted to share
Yeah.
also with the listeners in case that they're interested. Have you read The Atlas of the Heart by Brene Brown?
Oh, I have read a lot of Brene Brown, and she is very present in my book, but I have not read that one. So,
Yes. So when you were talking about emotions and
yeah.
how important that is to our well-being to experience them, it reminded me that so many of us too aren't able to identify our emotions. I believe in her
Hmm.
book, she said most people can identify 4. They say happy, sad, angry, something else. It's very
Right.
basic. And so basically what the Atlas of the Heart is a dictionary of emotions.
Mm,
And she walks us through everything from surprise to awe and wonder to the difference between guilt versus shame. I mean, there's
yes.
so many intricacies in what we're feeling. And the power of that is so that when we are experiencing them, we can identify what they are. And that is part of our well being and our happiness, is, like you said, to not only experience those emotions,
Yeah.
but to live in them, to know what they mean, to know what they
Yeah.
are, to
Yeah.
figure out what does that mean about ourselves and
Yeah.
the world around us. And so I think the Atlas of the Heart is just a really fascinating book for anyone who would like to delve a little deeper into
Yeah.
that emotional well-being.
And one thing that she really highlights, more than anyone that I've seen, is the connection between the fact that you cannot numb certain emotions without, to some degree, numbing other emotions. So you cannot just numb sadness or pain or fear without also numbing some of our joy. It's a whole package, our emotional being. So again, I don't think anyone can go wrong with Brene Brown, and that sounds like a fabulous book.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we have arrived at the end of our little talk here, very sadly and also very quickly. This is one of those episodes that I has been really therapeutic for me. So I want to say thank you to you, Jeff. Like
Mm.
I find such joy in this work I get to do, and there are certain talks that I need as reminders for myself, and that really expand the way I look at the world. And this has been one of those. So thank you.
And thank you. You shine so brightly. It's been a joy, and getting to hear some of your own stories and perspectives on this, it's been just a delight.
Thank you. But listen, I'm not letting you go
Yeah.
quite yet, because I do
Yep.
want to ask you the 2 personal questions that I ask everyone at the end of the episode before we tell everyone where they can follow along,
Yeah.
find your resources, and all of that. So the first question is, what is something you are currently paring down?
Something I'm currently paring down on. Well, it's interesting because I've been on this journey for a long time. And so there might not be something as literal in my paring down as sometimes you get your answers to. But I am trying to slow down the speed of my life. and there's a certain amount of work I need to do to make sure the bills are paid. But I'm definitely trying to slow down on just the number of to-dos on any single day. It's crazy because I can see absolutely the difference from one day to the next when I'm just rushing through versus one where I just take 30 minutes and climb back in bed or have a cup of tea or just go for a little walk. Night and day. Why don't I do that all the time? I don't. I get caught up. So my paring down, I think, has to do with just the pace of life and the number of to-dos. And I'm passionate. I love this work. I just keep throwing myself into it. That's awesome. And also, just the 20 minutes of calling a friend and talking with them or something like that. It's so sweet. So,
Oh, I love that answer. That's
oh,
fantastic.
yay. I
Yes,
passed.
you passed. You did. Okay, and then what's something that you're looking forward to right now?
Oh my goodness. So I am a very enthusiastic person and I'm pretty much always looking forward to something. And right now one of the things that is bittersweet is I can already feel the coming of summer and the ending of the school year. And even though that's still months away, and yet I do know that during the summer I'm going to get to spend some really special time. We have some stuff planned with my two kids who are 16 and 12. And I'm very aware that my 16-year-old, who is super college oriented, she is going away to college. So there's a definite end to this time of her living with me. And I'm not rushing through this time at all. I'm trying to make sure I savor this. So this summer has some really lovely things coming up where I'm going to spend some time with them.
Oh, that's wonderful. It's so wild how, I mean, this is a cliche, but how fast and how slow it goes, right? Like these little kid years I'm in, I feel like have been pretty slow.
Yep.
As Gretchen Rubin writes, the days are long, but the years are short. And I
Mm,
have felt that. And I know that it only gets more and more like that the older they get. So thank you for sharing how much you're really being present with your children at those ages. That's really special.
absolutely. I love it all mostly, and also honoring you those young kid years. Oh my goodness. Like talk about paring down on sleep. Sometimes sleep with such a distant stranger, things like that. So it's hard and challenging too. So that's very real. But
Yes, we can live in the duality there.
yes.
So, where can everyone find you online, buy your book, buy your course, and
Yeah.
just be exposed to your work here with Reclaiming the Sacred?
Absolutely. Well, I do think the book is the most intimate and immediate way that people could interact with some of these ideas. Reclaiming the Sacred, Healing Our Relationships with Ourselves and the World. And my name is Jeff Golden. You can get it everywhere, anywhere that you're buying books online or your local bookstore, or get it at your library. If it's not available, request it so that other people have access to it as well, is a wonderful way. And I do teach an online course. And it's funny you mentioned the cost because it is by donation. Each
Oh,
person
that's right.
decides what it is worth and what they have available to themselves. And I do that 2, 3, sometimes 4 times a year. I have one coming up this summer, so people can sign up for that. I cap it at 12 people. It's fairly intimate, and we dive into a lot of this information, but also a lot of experiences. So if you know these things now how do we bring these things alive? How do we nurture a better relationship with ourselves and with the world around us? And so and I would love it if anyone who wants to be part of that with me, please reach out to me through my website. Again, Jeff Golden, Reclaiming the Sacred. I'll pop up if you just do a search, and course information is there. So those are 2 lovely ways, or just email me and we can find other ways as well.
Perfect. And your website, is it just jeffgolden.com?
Reclaimingthesacred.net.
Okay.
But also, if you do remember Jeff Golden and Reclaiming the Sacred, just Google that and it'll come up.
And it'll come up.
So,
It will also,
yeah,
everyone, be in the show notes. So that should be easy. You can just go to this episode and his book
wonderful.
will be linked, his website will be linked, and all of that will be available there. So, Jeff, thank you again so much for joining me today. It has been a distinct pleasure.
Thank you so much. Keep shining. And the same for everyone out there. Keep shining. You're wonderful.
You just listened to an episode of Paring Down with me, Shannon Leyko. If you enjoyed the show, it would mean the world if you can leave a review wherever you listen and share this episode with a friend. Those reviews really are what keeps a podcast on its feet for the long haul, and I will read every single one with a huge smile on my face. So thank you ahead of time. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to hit subscribe. Also, be sure to follow along on Instagram at paring_down, where I offer lots of tips and inspiration for paring down, along with what's new here on the podcast. Till next time.